It is great to be back. How's it going, everybody? Welcome to a show where we basically take the camera anywhere we want to try to find secrets and new discoveries to some of our favorite games. And covering Pokemon Soul Silver Out of Bounds has been a ton of fun. The game oftentimes wants to pretend that it's in a 2D landscape, but rest assured, a lot of what you're looking at here is made up with 3D geometry. The camera is a little bit finicky though, so I want to thank Jasper, who made the site NoClip. It's used as a resource occasionally here in this episode. And also, of course, the animator Smashtoons for making that intro all those years ago. I got links to them in the video description, and with that said, let's get started. So the very first thing I wanted to show you guys was something that is at the very end of the game. I know, but it's really fascinating and I didn't want to save it for last. There are hidden orbs outside of each of the Elite Four's rooms. Now, 3 out of the 4 are identical to each other. They have like this white base with a little bit of blue swashed on it, and I can't figure out what the heck that was originally supposed to be, if anything. But one of the Elite Four rooms has a completely different texture that's just kind of slapped on there, and I can figure out where it originates from. It's the tiles that the character walks on, and there's this additional texture that's layered on top of it, and all that's on this orb. And you can definitely take my word for it. I looked at each individual pixel to see if it lined up with one another. So what you're looking at right now is the texture that's layered on top of this orb. Now, why do these orbs exist? I've got theories. One of them is that when you start the battles with each of these trainers, there's a special HUD graphic, and I thought maybe it was used for the special effects to be called in at a certain point. But that theory was somewhat debunked when you go into the last battle and there's no orb to be seen. So I think it's also possible that this orb was going to be originally used as some sort of effect that was going to be called in, but then the developers scrapped it to a point where whatever texture was supposed to be layered on top of this orb is no longer even used. But that last room that I was just talking about, what is inside there? Well, over to the right, instead of an orb, you can see 2 shadows for sprites, which is really bizarre. So with my due diligence, I played through the entire final battle with the camera panned out in such a way that when the battle's over, we can see if there's anything that goes on with those 2 sprites. And sure enough, the interviewer and Professor Oak get spawned in out of bounds, out of the player's view, and then walk up to the player. But that initial teleportation starts from out of bounds and then brings them inbounds. And that is not even the last instance of a character being brought from out of bounds. In so many instances, you can find story-based characters hiding in the woods. The first time I saw this was right at the start of the game with Professor Elm. Now, this is a particularly interesting case because this sprite, Professor Elm, never leaves this spot. Sure, Professor Elm does have story beats that demand his sprite be called in for the story, but for some reason, the sprite that's over in the corner there never goes away. And some players might be thinking, well, that's just the spawning point, you know, or something like that. Well, the reason why I find this all very odd is because this is the only instance where this happens. Other examples, like for example, your rival trainer, do have spots where they're hidden out of bounds, and once they're called into the story scene, you can see them warp to the coordinate where they need to be. In fact, one of the most absurd ones is Kurt inside the cave of the well. After you defeat Team Rocket, Kurt does show up for a story scene, but the entire time that you're in that cave, Kurt is just sitting on top of a pond, one that the player can't access at this point in the game. And he's so far off screen that it was actually really hard to find an angle in which the camera wouldn't start clipping the environment. But as you can see, that's how it works. And to answer a couple questions, I know some people are going to ask, what happens if you try to talk to them? Well, the talked prompt does come up, but they never have anything to say. And also, some people are going to want to know what happens when characters walk off screen. And I think the best example to show this is probably what's going to be the most sought after answer for that general topic, which is the 3 legendary dogs. Panning the camera out will show you where they go, and it's not too far off screen before they just simply disappear, and that applies to every single story beated character that walks off screen. But outside of NPCs, there are things to find out of bounds. To start with, the Dragon's Den. Oddly enough, there are 2 dragon statues, and I guess the interior designer wasn't thinking very well, because the most interesting part about those statues are not only not front facing, but they're also wedged behind a room that the player can't access. Taking the camera over there though won't show you the front of their faces, sadly, but it will show you that there are a couple of unused horns that are stored behind the wall for each dragon. And the very, very end of the game, where you register your Pokemon into the Hall of Fame, the shrine at the top is hiding a cleverly placed dev cube, which is not too common in this game. There are a couple more. I will share those in a minute. In the Indigo Plateau, if we move the character out of bounds and start moving the camera, you can see that there are massive texture sheets for rocky ground. And using Jasper's NoClip website, you could see just how many that are used and just how many that are placed. And what will happen if you actually walk on these plateaus? Well, it activates the game's mystery zone. This is one one of the most absurd things I've ever seen, but if you walk out of bounds in Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the game will take the time to tell you where you are, and the devs wrote it out as the mystery zone. Now, in my search, I didn't find anything too amazing. It's still kind of incredible that there's so much reused assets that are just kind of stored out here, despite the fact that the player would never be able to get to see it. It looks really, really good when you see the entire game's overworld map in something like the NoClip website, but outside of that, I can't think of too many reasons why this would even be here. But I will say thank you to the devs for making a next level sense of immersion that's really fun and really interesting to show it off on a show like Boundary Break. But moving on from that for now, this is just something that is really rare. In the route just above Olivine City, if you take the camera underneath the ground, there is a single tile that is still left in the game, and I'm not exactly sure why this would be here. Again, this is not something you typically see in the game at all. Looking underneath so many environments, most of it is just the void. But like I said, in this one area of the entire overworld map, you will find this one tile. Moving on, I wanted to talk about a couple of NPCs who have sprites for areas that the player would normally never be able to access. Like the first gym leader here has his back right up against the wall. You can't get behind him. But if we clip out of bounds and talk to him, you can still see that he has a backside. And the same can be said for the gym leader Chuck. As you can see, the rocks wedge him in such a way that the player should not be able to talk to him from behind. But courtesy of the show, we can show you what that would look like. Here's one of the most bizarre things. Every single Pokemon in the game has a little bit more graphics than you would normally be able to get to see, as exampled by Cyndaquil here. And even stranger, these sprites exist in a 3D plane. The environment doesn't, but I can manipulate where these characters are by shifting the camera around. And unique to the battle sprites alone, if we flip these sprites all the way around, you can see the image is mirrored on the opposite side, something that cannot be said for the overworld sprites, which I guess is a shame because it does break the immersion that would otherwise be pretty well preserved by taking the camera down to eye level. This one room that you're looking at here has a TV, it has a countertop, it has a fridge, and it has seats and all that stuff. And the game wants to give you the illusion of it all existing in a 2D world, but as you can see here, it's all rendered in 3D, and it looks fascinating. And the devs kind of pick and choose what they want to be in 3D, which is kind of bizarre. Things like the seat and the Nintendo Wii in the main character's bedroom are completely flat textures, but the laptop, the bed, the staircase, those are all fully 3D. In fact, the laptop has a fully modeled backside too, unlike the television and the bed. Again, that falls into the category of particularly rare because even buildings don't seem to have backsides, which makes perfect sense. Before we move on from the subject, I just want to show you one last thing that's kind of fun. Here's Meryl walking around in a square-shaped pattern. I just kind of wanted to show you what that looks like from another angle. And in fact, just for kicks, I'm going to shift the camera back into normal view just so that you can see the contrast between what the developers want you to see and what you can actually see at eye level. We're going to keep things moving along by talking about the Sprout Tower. And this is another example where the building is modeled on all sides. And like I said, it's very, very unusual and uncommon. Just about any other building in this game is not modeled on all sides, but this one is. Maybe the developers thought that there would be a reason why it would be modeled on all sides for maybe a cutscene or something, but all you get to see in the game is a slight pan up that allows you to see somewhat of the tip of the building, never the back. Speaking of the top of buildings, I wanted to show you a couple that don't allow you to see the entirety of the building at any given time, so there are details here that you would never get to see as the normal player. Like the Poke Avalon Dome, for example. Even though this one pans up, you don't get to see all the details of the fire like you do right here. So some poor animator for the Pokemon Company went for the trouble of making a fire breathing loop, only for most of it not to be seen at all. And here's an area that's really fascinating. Fully 3D trees, a large fully modeled building, and even a half sky dome. This is all because Ho-Oh is supposed to show up in the gold version. And in the gold version, there's this whole cutscene where the legendary bird flies around the building, and all that's left in place for the player to walk through to get to the tower, making this one of the most intricately designed areas in the entire game. But to give you another example of just what I mean when I say most of the buildings are not fully modeled, this is the top of that tower, and this is used for a cutscene too, and yet even with this, the developers chose to keep the angling downward and keep you from seeing the back panel of this roof, because if you could, you'd see that it wouldn't exist at all. And even the walls for in between the roofs are modeled on no sides except for the front, since the camera does pan down well enough for you to see those bells that you're seeing on the building. And you also gotta love that L-shaped texture texture to represent the background. Backgrounds in Heart Gold and Soul Silver occasionally pop up from time to time. Like for example, the first gym here, it's a little hard to show you what I'm talking about, but it sort of wraps around the tower and you can see how it works. And then there's the lighthouse with a view of the town down below, and I just wanted to show you what that looks like out of bounds. It's a completely flat texture, and the way that it's represented is it has a couple of trees and some lights. And now let's talk about Lugia. Since this is the Soul Silver version, there's a special cutscene that plays when you summon Lugia, and before Lugia comes out, there's a flat sprite to represent the silhouette of Lugia, and all while that's going on, behind the rocky wall of the waterfall, you can see the 3D model of Lugia resting behind with no animation. In fact, we can see the exact moment in which Lugia springs out and is revealed to the player. And what's really cool about that is you can see the dev cube that is used to spawn in Lugia. The dev cubes in Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver seem to have like a grid, almost Rubik's-like cube, and they can change the color of the faces at will, it seems. Now, if I was to walk into a town from out of bounds and not do all the necessary triggers to load things in properly, all the dev cubes that are supposed to have a function are all revealed. Like for example, this building over here is supposed to have a smokestack, and there's a dev cube way up top to spawn in smoke. And then down below is a trigger for when the player wants to go through a door. And the same could be said for the well. The well's just completely replaced with a dev cube. And of course, what that dev cube is supposed to do is that when the player touches it, you go down into the well. It's really fun to see what gets spawned in and what doesn't. And now for another rare instance in this game, and that is rooms that exist in the same loading zone. You could probably think of many areas of Pokemon that could benefit from having a shared loading zone, but for Pokemon Soul Silver, the only instances that I could find of this are the entrances to the underground tunnel in Goldenrod City. And for me, the only other instance that I could personally find was this gym right here. So like if we take the camera over to the right, you can see like a silhouette of sorts. And in truth, those are the other rooms that are just unloaded, but there's some sort of effect that is just improperly loaded and left behind, so we can actually see that in plain sight, which is really cool. If we go into the next room, we can see that now that room is loaded in, and the silhouette of the room that we were in before is where it should be, in the center. Hey, you ever wanted to know what it would be like to be a Pokemon inside of a Pokeball? Well, you're about to find out. So taking the camera inside here will show you that the inside of the balls are fully modeled because they do open at some point to give you your Pokemon, but it's such a brief scene that you really can't lock in and kind of grasp all the details that are inside the Pokeball. But as I'm explaining things here, you can clearly see all the lines and grids that are normally inside of that ball, and you have all the time in the world to breathe and soak it in. And also, I just wanted to point out that the background for the Pokeballs rests on an L-shaped geometry. And speaking of other 3D geometries, when you're on the title screen of Soul Silver, you see Lugia just kind of swimming through the ocean. And I just wanted to pan the camera out to kind of give you an idea of the amount of geometry that's needed to pull this scene off. It's kind of difficult to show you because sadly, no one was willing to make a field of view tool for me in the making of this episode. But if you can ignore the clipping, you can make out the idea that it's all kind of wrapped in a giant sky dome, and that there's a flat platform with a moving texture that rests below Lugia. And one of the things that I don't think is shown at any angle at any time is the sun breaking through the ocean, resting above Lugia. And then I also wanted to show you that the camera can also move around when you're selecting an item, and you know that there's a 3D model representing where you're accessing your bag. Kind of an over-the-top detail for a primarily 2D-esque looking game. You can see all the details of the trainer that the game normally wouldn't allow you to see because the camera is so restricted. And now let's talk about a couple of cool little effects, one of which here, a blue texture underneath every small body of water. And what's funny is that the devs kind of messed up here, you can see. And so as a quick band-aid, what would accidentally show off the void a little bit is a second blue plane that's placed underneath the original blue plane to extend the amount of blue that you see. And that's just so that the water can have a bit of transparency on the top. Another cool effect is dark caves. Panning the camera out will show you that in order to pull this effect off, all they did was create a texture and place it in front of the game's camera, because otherwise the area is completely lit. And one more cool effect that I'd love to talk about is the reflections. On any body of water, really, you can see a reflection of yourself, your Pokemon, and anybody that stands above the water. And panning the camera down can show you that to pull this effect off, all the game devs did was create a doubled image of whatever sits above the water and then just place it flat in the game world, which is not too far away from the position of the player. The last thing I want to mention is not technically boundary break, it's more like sequence break. Any fans of the show remember that one? I really regret this, but I found out that at the time that you're supposed to get Lugia, if you clip around all the blocks that stop you from going to Ho-Oh, the cutscene for Ho-Oh plays out without the kimono girls and then freezes at one of these scenes with the bell. But sadly, I did not think to record that. I mean, you kind of got an idea of what I'm talking about here. But anyways, I wanted to make it up to you guys by showing you another sequence break. Like, for example, what happens if you encounter a random Pokemon without any Pokemon of your own? And what happens is you get a level 0 nameless creature that looks like a sponge. It also does the shiny Pokemon effect, followed by the game saying, what will? And if you look at the bottom screen where there would be a Pokemon, there is a unique image of a question mark instead. And then instead of being blank, it's just a whole bunch of question marks, and it says, has R moves left. And then the opposing Pokemon will attack, and it says, but there was no target. And then it'll tell you that you're out of Pokemon, and you'll black out. Yeah, well, like I said, it's awesome to be back. Here's a small picture from my Alaska vacation. I got to see the Aurora Borealis. I'm super excited. Yes, Simpsons meme, put them down below. Thank you to Snipey and Ethan for doing an excellent job filling in my place while I was gone. I really appreciate you guys. And if none of this matters to you because you're brand new, subscribe button's on the screen if you want to click it. It'll help future videos show up on your homepage. But I got a Pokemon X and Y video that's on the screen right now too. Go ahead and click that. It's honestly one of the more underrated episodes of the show. My next video is probably going to be Splatoon 3, and Snipey's going to hit you up with Scorn. Take it easy, guys.